We have a panel discussion now on management development and the growing importance of the skills agenda. I'm pleased to say that we have a top panel of experts here who are raring to go, and they're going to be debating the issues facing managers across all different organisations. And the idea is to do this discussion in a sort of question time style, and I have several themes for the panel to discuss. Some of them will overlap, and obviously we'll rely on your questions as well to help frame the different issues that I'm going to bring up. Now, first of all, I'd like to welcome all the panellists and introduce them to you, and I'd like to welcome Professor Julia King, who's sitting on the far left, your right. And Julia is Vice-Chancellor of Aston University and also a member of the governing body of the European Institute of Innovation and Technology and a member of the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on the future of transportation. I'd love to hear someone answer the phone saying all of that, actually. It's the longest company name I've ever heard. Julia, also in 2007, you were appointed by the Chancellor of the Exchequer to lead the King Review to examine vehicle and fuel technologies. What is the main purpose of that review and how much progress have you made to date?
The purpose of the review is really to address what CO2 reductions could we get from the transport sector along our path to an 80% reduction by 2050. And we've had a lot of progress this year. I've been very encouraged by both the way that the Committee on Climate Change has picked up the transport agenda as being a key one for the UK, and indeed the recent announcement by the government of the formation of the Office of Low Emission Vehicles, the role of which will be to drive the rapid introduction of ultra-low emissions vehicles into the UK, and the Climate Change Committee has set an ambition for about 1.7 million electric vehicles by 2020. So that's going to be quite a challenge, both in terms of changing consumer behaviour and in terms of developing a new industry.
But consumer behaviour is more open to change now that climate change has been more or less proven and all the doubters are beginning to drift away.
I hope so, although I think the recent surveys by people like the RAC Foundation have shown that the recession has actually made us all rather more inward focused and more risk averse, and climate change, because it's a long-term kind of threat, has gone down our agendas in terms of importance, and a sort of more of a me agenda has risen back to the top. So I think we've taken a step backwards, actually.
Well, Julian, welcome to you, and thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. Of course, we have Ruth Spellman, the Chief Executive of the CMI, who we heard speak earlier, and will be joining me for the final interview. What would you like to get out of this panel discussion, Ruth?
I think an insight from the panel members on some of the issues we've been discussing today. Things like how we engage young people more with management and leadership. How do we challenge ourselves around thinking new thoughts even though we're living in recessionary times? And what practical insights, what experience insights do the panel members have on those issues?
Okay, thank you very much. And also welcome to Jonathan Kestenbaum. Have I pronounced your surname correctly?
Perfect.
Thank you. Jonathan was at Apex Partners, the private equity investment group, where he was Chief of Staff to Sir Ronald Cohen, who was Apex Partners founder and chairman. Now, together, apparently, with Sir Ronald, Jonathan was instrumental in building the Portland Trust, which developed a $500 million fund for small and medium-sized businesses pertinent to the Middle East. Am I correct in thinking that's right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
And appointed Chief Executive of NESTA in 2005. And NESTA is the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. And NESTA apparently is exclusively focused on fostering innovation in the UK. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we're the largest source of seed finance for very early stage, speculative, risky ideas, which invariably are coming out of the universities of this country, which are coming out of laboratories and increasingly coming out of the minds of very creative young people. And with the disappearance of bank debt, with the disappearance of other sources of finance, NESTA is one of those places which puts risk finance right at the heart of really creative, imaginative ideas. So we've got a very good picture on what the emerging talent is looking like in terms of young people going into entrepreneurial businesses. And it's a pretty rosy picture.
Okay, that's very positive to hear. Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. Welcome to Michael Davis. Michael is the Director of Strategy and Performance at the UK Commission for Employment Skills. I particularly like your photograph, Michael. You're very elusive. You do a side shot only. Is it the front profile? It would cost a lot more money to do or something?
I think they had to hunt really hard for that one. I think it was actually taken from Leicester College, so they found it. I was trying to hide one.
Yeah. Well, Michael, I know you previously worked at the Centre for Enterprise, or the CFE, where as Managing Director you led them from very modest beginnings to what is today a national research and management company. Now with the UK Commission for Employment and Skills, that's a relatively new body though, isn't it? That's only been formed really in the last, year or so?
That's right, yeah.
What was that all about?
Yep, so the UK Commission for Employment and Skills came into being in April 2008. Our remit is as an advisory body to the UK government, recognising that skills is increasingly devolved down to individual nations, and it is and as an advisory role in terms of employment and skills, and also to be a champion of greater employer engagement in both employment and skills policy. I guess our main publication this year, which many of you perhaps seen, was in respect of Ambition 2020, which was for the Commission to set out where are we now in terms of our skills competitiveness and where will we likely to be by 2020. And it's one of those games of two halves. The first part of the story is historic improvements, really, really positive improvement over the last 10 years. The challenge is that internationally we haven't moved much at all. We're about 18th or 19th compared to other industrialized nations. And more concerning is that for 2020 we weren't seeing ourselves to be much higher than 17th or 18th either. Sorry, so we weren't seeing much by way of an improvement, and I was listening to Peter Manson the other day, who described skills as the new oil, and it's quite a useful metaphor. So if you say that that's our forward forecast of our oil stocks, then we've got a real challenge to address as a country.
Absolutely. I know your boss as well, who's chair of World Skills London, a board I'm on as well, and it's a huge challenge, isn't it? Not only to keep ahead, but not fall down behind the World League table any further.
And I think what we're saying is, we've said there's three things to that. Clearly we need a set of employment and skill services, be that in colleges, universities and providers that are responsive to individual and employer needs. But equally we need to do much more on raising individual aspiration, opportunity, and the hard message, and I think where the Commission has made a very positive inroad, given that we are led by some very leading employers, is that employers need to do more, and we need more high value add business models. We need more businesses that see their competitive advantage in the world based on their human capital, their talent and their skills, and from that then flows a greater demand for skills. And that's been quite a shift, because perhaps 2002, 2003, it was seen as a supply side problem, that it was, universities, colleges not making what was required. So we have definitely moved to talking about how do we raise employer ambition and demand.
Thank you. And last but not least, our panellist Richard Hill. Delighted to have you here as well. I know Lord Eatwell was originally deemed down on the programme, but you're a worthy replacement, particularly getting endorsed by a previous speaker because you're from Rolls-Royce and Director of International Learning for Rolls-Royce. Have a very outward-focused agenda, don't you? You travel the world, giving best practice to all sorts of organisations, companies. Just give a little flavour of what exactly you get involved in.
Well, I should have explained to start that it's Rolls-Royce PLC, that's the power systems company, civil aerospace, defence, marine energy, and not the motor car division. So those of you looking for a cheap deal on luxury cars, sorry about that. I have two roles really for Rolls-Royce. One is to develop learning strategies for the corporation. So we're looking at a whole range of skills or competency solutions for everything from our senior directors to our apprentices. And also, we take the whole concept of learning and development and apply it to our supply chain and our stakeholder base. So, as Nadine said, I spend a lot of time travelling the world, I suppose, talking to our customers and stakeholder governments to work out how Rolls-Royce might develop learning partnerships with certainly airlines around the world and certainly governments for whom education and skill development is a key agenda item. So we take the Rolls-Royce expertise and our learning partners, and perhaps I should just add, I'm very gratified to see so many educationists in the audience, because I actually am a strong, passionate supporter of industry education partnerships. We use them enormously. In fact, I can't survive without these partnerships, both in terms of the way they support Rolls-Royce and our customer base. And maybe this evening or later, I'll be very happy to talk to members of the audience about how industry and education can work together on those fronts.
Thank you, Richard. So that's your panel. First thing I'd like each member of the panel to consider in one paragraph, please, and we're talking about that bigger paragraph, say with a font size of 10, I'd like you to outline your views on why management development is so important to the British economy. And Julia, if I can start with you.
Right. Well, the future clearly is about a more highly skilled economy where knowledge and capabilities will be even more important. And I'm rather taken by this vision that I run a new oil company. But here we are in a time of very radical change where we need to deliver a radically new economy. We need to deliver a radical green economy. And yes, it's against the background of a recession where people are feeling nervous. They're not feeling very risk-oriented. And that's a challenging situation for delivering change. So it's a particularly challenging time for management, and I'm sure lots of you will be feeling that and will be very well aware of that. In my sector, we have some particularly interesting management challenges, I think. Most of our senior managers are, of course, people who started their careers as academics. They probably never intended to be managers, and they've probably had very little training. And yet we are a particularly interesting, one particular extreme of a kind of organisation structure in universities, because our origins are as democratic communities of scholars. That's an interesting kind of organisation to try and manage, particularly as we're now, of course, also businesses. We face increased competition for research funding for overseas students. We're looking at potential cuts of around 20% in our core government funding. We're seeing falling numbers of UK undergraduates because of the demographic shift in this country. So we need to be very fleet of foot. We need to be innovative. We need to be embracing change in the way we operate. We need to be being strategic. And yet we're a democratic community of scholars where traditionally we've done everything by committees, where everybody has a say, where everything can be voted on. And so it's a really challenging time for our managers because we're having to turn organisations which are fundamentally democratic into organisations which can be very fast-moving. And so it's a time when I think our management in universities is really being stretched in terms of having to understand how to be trusted, because we've got to become more autocratic. And that's it really challenges our culture, and it's enormously challenging for sort of people in taking their first steps in management. And the sector is very much focused on how do we provide much better management training and support in order to help people lead universities through a really essential period of change, but also recognising that actually we're providing the fuel for the new future. So we have these very precious outputs of capable, skilled people, and indeed of new knowledge itself. So an exciting time, but putting real pressures on management, and I see that right through my organisation, and I recognise that we have a big need for support for our management teams.
Thank you, Julia. That was a very long paragraph, though, more of a dissertation. So, Ruth?
Thank you very much, Nadine. I just think, for me, it's about managers and leaders creating the wealth. And we need wealth creators if we're going to sustain high standards of living and achieve a civilised society. And we need mechanisms, platforms, instruments, training to enable those wealth creators to survive and compete in the modern world. And therefore we do need proper management and leadership development. I happen to think that, it's too easy to pass the buck. All of us as managers and leaders need to take responsibility for our own skills, for keeping them up to date. And we as an organisation, our sole reason for existing is to improve the quality of management and leadership. I think it's possible to do more with less. It is about managing better, having better qualified managers who understand the jobs that they're doing. And I think there'll be more and more pressure, whether you're in the public sector, in the academic sector, or in industry, in companies like Rolls-Royce, for managers to raise their level of performance. And I think we have to think long and hard about how we do that. And finally, I think we need to dig deep in terms of all of the talent pool that we actually have access to. There are loads of people out there with managerial and leadership talent. We're not digging in yet. And we're not making it easy for people to rise through those opportunities to get to the top of companies and to actually show what they can do. And it may not be at the top of a company. It may be running at a middle level. It may be running a service. It may be all sorts of things that we need in our society. So digging deep is something we really need to get much better at.
Thank you. Jonathan?
Yeah, I think a couple of quick things. We all know the apocryphal story is that during recessionary times, during times of corporate crisis, it is decisive leadership, management, which drives countries and companies out of crisis. Apocryphal stories, we all know them. I'm sure it's true. I'm sure it's true. But at the broader level, the answer to your question is very simply this, that the sectors which have driven this economy in the last 2 decades, utterly disproportionately, financial services, a whole range of elaborate financial instruments, and speculative property prices have disappeared. So the sectors which will drive this economy in the next 2 decades will be totally different, very much along the lines of Julia's vision. They will be the technology-driven sectors, the innovation-driven sectors, biotech, clean energy, digital media, creative industries, pharma, and those are sectors which are going to need a much more sophisticated type of management to ensure that they can provide us with the type of prosperity that the traditional sectors used to. Second and quick answer to you is actually not about the private sector, it's about the public sector. Public sector, what, 34-35% of GDP. As of about 10 minutes ago, government debt was about £175 billion, probably gone up in the last 5 minutes. But the real point is that for public sector managers, they will have no choice in an era of cuts but to be hugely imaginative, hugely radical, and all of that requires immensely well-qualified managers and leaders.
And it's very easy to criticise the public sector, but there's some great shiny examples out there, and maybe more emphasis and focus should be put on those public sector organisations that are doing incredibly well and learn best practice from them.
Public sector is full of extremely talented people. They're working in an utterly dysfunctional system. So therefore, what you've got to do is you've got to carve out pockets of the system that lend themselves to ingenuity and innovation. You can't work on a system-wide basis. It's utterly broken. But that's a different conversation for another time.
Michael?
Let's try and speed these answers up. The Commission prides itself on being evidence-led, and when I said I was coming here to speak, one of my research colleagues sort of trebled the weight of my bag today by piling in all the research that says that management and leadership makes a difference, that the UK compared to other countries isn't as good as it ought to be. And to be fair, we've known that for an awful long time. So the question then for me is, well, we know there's a problem, and why are we not addressing it? And it falls into the category of a bit like health. We all know that we could lose a couple of pounds, and we all know that we could do with doing a little bit more exercise. And how are we really going to achieve those changes? It's in behavioural change and consciousness. So for me, the question is, how do you make people much more conscious of their role as a leader and manager in their everyday life so that they don't see their technical subject first, be that a teacher, a doctor, or someone working in the public service, but they see themselves as someone who empowers and enables others. So how do we get that consciousness up? And then how do we get that behavioural change so that individuals see the role and difference that leadership and management can make? So I think we know that there's management and leadership makes a huge difference. We know that relative to other countries we need to do more. I think we need to focus more on then how now do we get the behavioural changes. And perhaps then the challenge is that we too often look at it like a product sell. So, we sell learning products, but really what we're trying to achieve is some behavioural change. And particularly when you think about smaller businesses, it's changing in behaviours, how they learn off others, that I think is the key to raising up their management development performance.
Richard?
Right, I'm not quite sure what a short paragraph comprises, but I think as a huge generalisation, I think corporations are beginning to move away from strategy development into the execution of the business, and they're looking, generally speaking, much more into operational efficiencies and process innovation or renovation. And therefore, we're having to equip all our teams, certainly in Rolls-Royce, and we're true of many corporations, in terms of how to lead and react to change. And the whole premise of this is making sure the corporation, the company, is more agile and flexible with its team. And so, in that sense, we're having to develop strategies, learning strategies, which facilitate that state of play in a corporation. And the biggest challenge for us, of course, is as we are increasingly becoming a global company, how we globalize that across the whole workforce. And I think just a final point on the global side. Within Rolls-Royce, and certainly outside Rolls-Royce, when I talk to organizations, the focus is very much more on applied learning. It's how do we get the best of current practice merged with current thinking. And that's why I think this industry education partnership is just so critical in moving the skill base of the UK on.
Jonathan, one of the first key areas I want to look at is could the impact of the recession have been lessened if we had better qualified managers?
Look, if you, first of all, you've got to understand, this was a recession which has been fueled by the disappearance of credit. And that makes it different from other recessions. And I mean, I think the significance of that is you really need to understand that there were two reasons for that. There are two reasons for this extraordinary credit bubble. Number one, you had financial instruments which were adding money into the system, elaborate, but probably responsible, reduced risk, added value, good thing. Alongside that, you had the crazy, misaligned incentives of huge amounts of irresponsible credit going into the system. With incredibly lax oversight. I love the story of the American mortgage company that used to allocate subprime mortgages, and when it did its valuation, it did it on the basis of Google Earth. That's what it did it on. Forget surveyors, we don't need surveyors, we don't need property valuers. We've got a satellite picture, if it's got 2 up, 2 down, we can give them a 100% mortgage. And I think the point that I'm making is that if you subscribe to the McKinsey's view of the world, which I do, which is the behavior that gets rewarded is the behavior that gets reinforced, the incentives and the rewards that was going on within much of the financial services was utterly out of control and broke the system. So the answer to your question is absolutely, that is fundamentally a management question.
And Ruth, we had a question in that's come in from a blog. In a recession, is that the best time to invest in management development?
Absolutely. I think that in a recession, you need to look at the value you're getting from your management team. And that essentially means looking at their skills and how you develop them. Because you don't have the option of bringing in fancy consultants. You don't have the option of spending thousands more pounds on buying in solutions. You need to really understand your management strengths. And sometimes that's a real spur to find out new talent in your organisation. Also, it's a real challenge to the whole organisation to come up with some of those new ideas we've been hearing about today. In other words, without a crisis, sometimes there's no progress. So I think, again, both the managers and the teams that they manage can then be challenged around new and innovative ways of doing things. And I actually think there's no excuse for not doing that. It's what we should be doing anyway. And the crisis makes it even more imperative from a cost perspective.
Questions from the audience, please. I'd like to have your comments to the panel members around this area, or you may have some other burning issue. Gentleman just there put his hand up. Is anyone at the back putting their hands up as well? I wouldn't hate to have ignored you because I can't see you that well. Has anyone got their hand up at the back as well for another question, a secondary question after this one? Oh, gentleman there at the front. Lovely. You first. Thank you.
Thanks very much to the panel. Jason Devery, University of Surrey. Bearing in mind that a third of the UK workforce will be over 50 years old by the year 2020, are there currently provisions in learning education for managers at the moment who may be approaching 60, 65, who want to stay re-engaged within the workforce, bearing in mind that we'll probably all have to because we won't have enough pension money to actually keep us going otherwise?
Michael.
Some of you may have seen a publication recently from NIACE, and they did their inquiry into lifelong learning, and they made a very articulate case about seeing lifelong learning in 4 stages, pre-25, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, and now saying 75 plus. And then, of course, they did a quick little bit of the numbers in terms of, well, where is the spend? And, of course, it's no surprise the spend is all in the pre-25 in terms of where public money comes. And I think that was a really helpful start of a discussion that now needs to happen, which is that as the workforce begins to age, and you're absolutely right, and as people do need to stay in the workforce for longer, have we got that right public settlement, if you like, in terms of where public money is being prioritised? But I think we're just at the start of that debate that says if we have to keep, not have to because people want to stay in the workforce for longer, perhaps out of choice or necessity, then we have to think about how is learning supported. And from the Commission's perspective, very interested in us opening up that discussion on what would fully funded and operational learning accounts look like, which really stayed with you for that journey of progression.
But the way the UK is at the moment, will there be a shortage of jobs? So regardless of the ageing population and asking them to work for longer, will there be enough jobs to satisfy that market?
The work that we did on Working Futures says that the economy continues to expand and there are still people leaving. So we're still saying that there are more jobs than we currently have people. So there's still sort of growth in overall employment trends, certainly up to, well, over the medium term. So once you're through the recession, then there's still lots of opportunities for people to work.
Okay. Question here. Thank you for that question. There's a microphone coming your way. I think there's only one in the audience so far. I think we have the other one, don't we? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name's Ian Smith. I'm an executive mentor in the Faculty of American Co. I'm also chairman of Young Enterprise in the UK. My question is particularly to Michael. Michael, can you help me with the paradox? There seems to be that people are talking about the quality of leadership and management in the UK not being up to some of its competitors. Yet, from my understanding, we have some of the best business schools in the world. In our corporations, global corporations, UK management seem to rise to the top. So where is this problem?
Yeah, I think that you're right, and I'll probably look to Julia to answer some of this. I think some of the challenges, the extent to which those leading business schools really achieve full reach into small businesses, and how can we get more of that happening. And so Ian and I, when we worked previously on the Leadership Management Advisory Panel, there are a number of examples of where you had those leading business schools working through local further education colleges and really getting that world-class leadership provision that they offered to their corporate clients out into the small business sector. The challenge was that that was the minority, not the majority in terms of the delivery. And so one of the things that we looked at was what would be the incentives for leading business schools to make that offer to small businesses. And I guess perhaps the economic conditions have changed, but certainly if you're a large leading business school and a large corporate comes along and offers you a big sum of money, then it's always going to be likely to be more appealing than that comes forward from small businesses. So how you get some of that reach, I think, is very important.
Julia, do you concur with that?
Yes, I think there's some very interesting issues that have been raised there. Certainly in Birmingham and the West Midlands, we have a very low level of graduates in the workforce. And that's partly because we do have an enormous number of small businesses and a lot of quite traditional small businesses from the manufacturing sector, from the automotive supply chain sector. And we've seen it as very important regionally to try and get this engagement of small business with the university sector. And we've done this through an innovation voucher scheme, which has now been taken up nationally. But we have very recently been able to persuade our RDA, Advantage West Midlands, that these innovation vouchers should not only be for funding links between small businesses and universities to provide them with help with their technology, but we've now managed to persuade them they should also be funding these vouchers to engage with universities in the regions, with the business schools, to help small businesses with their leadership and management skills. And these are vouchers for £3,000, which the small business gets to spend in a university of its choice, so somewhere convenient. And we're looking forward. The first tranche of those is just going out, and we'll be monitoring in some detail the impact of those vouchers in the leadership and management support area, because we think that's absolutely key, as has just been said.
And they've been rolled out to all the devolved nations as well, or just within England?
The voucher scheme itself, which we kicked off in the UK, has now been rolled out across England, but we've also had inquiries from Wales and Northern Ireland, where they're looking to roll out similar.
And it's looking encouraging, it's looking very positive that this is what small businesses want, and it's going to match their needs and requirements.
Small businesses have been hugely enthusiastic about it, yes, in the West Midlands region. Yes, it's been a real hit.
Okay. Richard, to you, how do you make a business case for better qualified managers and leaders? Microphone, actually. Sorry.
I'd like to think that the case almost makes itself, and certainly in many, I guess, forward-thinking organisations, the lead comes from the top. I mean, we are particularly blessed with a chief executive and group executive who believe that, and in fact it's almost written every year in the annual report, that individual development and competitive advantage go hand in hand. And I think if you have that championship, then the case just cascades itself down. But in many organisations now, the organisations are increasingly becoming flat organisations, where individuals take on much more responsibility than hitherto. They have to take decisions which, with very little awareness coming in advance. And so I think we have to prepare our managers to take on roles which are new and which have a whole set of defined competences. And in fact, what we're doing now, and again, this is mirrored in many organisations, is to define roles throughout the corporation against competences, knowledge, skills, behaviours against any particular role. And then people are measured against those. And as we put in place reward systems which are based on corporate objectives, which are based on individual performance, then the skill set to support that performance becomes paramount. And I think the demand for management and professional education comes not just collectively from the organisation itself, but you get this groundswell from individuals wanting that support to perform the very job against which they're being rewarded and measured.
And the Leach Review looked at demand-led skills being the major way forward, didn't it, Michael?
It did. It did, and for those of you that work in publicly funded provision, that's done a huge amount. I think that there's still more that we can do to get to systems that are truly customer empowering. And again, some of the Commission's thinking at the minute is, how do we create more information, more informed information for customers, so that the challenge always in these areas where public funding is involved is that obviously the public purse wants to see accountability in return, and that inevitably has a habit of restricting choice. So I think, as someone once said of Train to Gain, it's demand-led so long as it's a Ford T-car that you want in one particular colour. So how do we get to a truly demand-led? Well, we need to invest much more in our customers, employers, individuals, make them the most informed users of skills services, and then I think we really can start to look at how it would be demand-led and how that would be supported by accounts for individuals.
Jonathan, what can we do to ensure we remain competitive in the global marketplace?
I think we know two things about being competitive in the global marketplace. Number one, the pockets of our workforce which are able to build in the values, the skills and the attitudes of innovation, whether that is service, process or product, and you've got probably examples of all of those up here, will be those companies and those sectors which will be able to compete. It's as simple as that. After all, I think we've all agreed on one thing in terms of what we want with this economy. We want it to be a high-wage economy. We want it to be a full employment economy with a modest public sector. Now, if those are the criteria that everybody here will sign up to right now, the only way that an economy of that shape can be competitive is if it's innovation-driven. The second thing you need to do, and we're increasingly learning it, is that the route to productivity will travel through increasingly networked managers and leaders. You had Charlie Ledbetter here, so you're probably networked out by now, his favorite word, but he's absolutely right that the more we have the ability to build networks across institutions, disciplines, companies and sectors, that's where the next bounce of the competitive ball is going to come from.
Yeah, and Charles' name is hard to pronounce, as you've just proved. I think I pronounce it like it's Ledbetter. Would you believe it? I know, I fell for that one as well, so you're not alone there. A couple of questions I've got from the audience, want to pose. First one to Julia. Is the conventional academic MBA no longer fit for purpose and only suitable for consultants, not real managers?
I suppose I would say, I'm sure if you said to any business school, is the conventional MBA not fit for purpose, they would all say, well, we don't teach a conventional MBA, and I hope that's true. I am sure that all of our business schools are looking at how their courses should change in addressing need.
Yes.
I mean, we've just done really well in the Economist rankings for careers and salaries. We came top in Europe at Aston Business School for our MBA students, and I think we would claim that was because actually MBAs are changing to meet the needs of employers and indeed of the individuals taking them.
Are you meeting them quick enough, though?
Oh, sorry, are we?
Are you meeting their needs quick enough?
Well, given the employability of the people who come out at the end of the process, I think we probably are. But in a way, I take your point, and I have. I do actually think, in general, we do need to get business schools actually kind of back into the arms of business. I actually am slightly concerned in this country that we have, through things like the research assessment exercise, that we have tried almost to make our business schools too academic. And once business schools are producing a paper that me, when I was a senior manager in Rolls-Royce, that I wouldn't have understood, I sort of think, what's the business school doing? You know, it's supposed to be there to make life better for me as somebody leading in business. And so if it starts being so obscure I can't understand what it's talking about, I think it's losing the plot.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do think there are some issues there, and we need to be very careful how we assess the research and the research drive in business schools, because it's got to help business to be useful.
Ruth and Richard, I want you to have a quick comment on this question that came in as well. Can the public sector develop an innovation culture when a whole generation of managers have grown up being told what to do and when and how to do it by central government and other agencies? Ruth?
Well, absolutely, I think that's possible. I think it's happening all around us. I think some of the NHS trusts are doing a huge amount of innovation. But unfortunately, you know, we never hear the good news. We never get to celebrate that success. And also, it's quite hard to replicate that success across public sector bodies. And I think this is where, you know, a professional institute can really help, because we're there to promote good practice. And again, we can share some of that good practice and give it some airspace, and hopefully give it some media space even, because you know, how often do you see scare stories about the public sector where, in fact, you know, there's a lot of people have been toiling away very hard to produce an excellent product. So I salute a lot of the people that I meet in the public sector. I think they're doing an excellent job. And actually, they need fewer, better managers.
Richard, can I have a quick comment? Because obviously you deal with government, public sector all around the world.
Just very briefly, I mean, if you take Charles Leadbeater's definition of innovation as being progressive improvements rather than just necessarily an invention, then every organisation, whether it's public or private, has scope for innovation. And one of the best vehicles we find is having people who work in, I guess it's called a community of practice, with common interests, and you can create an environment for innovation by just getting like-minded people together, and you don't really need funding for that. You just create an environment to spark of ideas and spark of a new way of thinking, and give an issue or a problem, and solutions will generally come forward in that kind of thriving environment.
Can I get a question quickly from the floor? We are running out of time. There's a gentleman just there.
We do have one at the back of the room as well, in the darkness here.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much for that. We'll do that one, and then I've got a final question, because time has nearly come upon us.
Hello, this is Paul Kinsell, the President of Doncaster and Barnsley and Director of PKMG Interim Management. I'd like to ask the panel what the key standards are that they look for going forward in their managers, and for example, the importance of CMI membership, and particularly the new chartered manager status.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I have to say join the CMI, right? That's the first thing we look for. But in all seriousness, I think when you have those two things sitting alongside each other, a commitment to professional development, alongside a commitment, and this is really important during recessionary times, to the type of agility and opportunism and flexibility, which, to be frank with you, you don't always get from business schools. You know, I am a very proud holder of an MBA, and I wouldn't say that it was my MBA which necessarily taught me the attitudes of agility and flexibility and changing your mind and a different type of problem solving. It gave me a type of discipline. It gave me a framework within which to operate. But I'm increasingly looking, it's an utterly personal response, I'm increasingly looking for the innovation-related attributes, which have everything to do with curiosity, with imagination, with ingenuity, with risk-taking, with problem-solving, and above all else, and this is the point about the public sector being able to innovate, the ability to be resilient in the face of failure. Above all else, that is the prime innovation-related attribute, the ability to be resilient in the face of failure.
Thank you. Another member of the panel would like to jump in there?
I'll quickly come in. I'm chairman of two organisations, completely different, a further education college and a small manufacturing company. Two people who lead those organisations are completely different. The three things, though, that they've got in common, which I think I admire hugely, is one is just real fierce resolve, but delivered with great humility. And that, for me, speaks volumes of really good managers in recessionary and challenging times, is that they don't lose track of what they're seeking to achieve. They're not blown over, but they've got humility, ability to learn, and then this just fierce, quietly confident resolve to get things done. And the final thing that I've really noticed is this ability to have a forward conversation, so not to get knocked over by what's currently going on in terms of recessionary conditions in, if you like, the private sector economy, recessionary conditions just about to come into the public sector economy, a real clear sense about where they're going. And so for me, I would look for someone who can have that forward conversation with you, humility and resolve.
Last question at the back there before I bring it back and say thank you to our panel.
Hi, I think it's me. Daniel Cellino from BBB Business School. Just can conventional business schools with academics who haven't been in practice really teach the skills as opposed to the knowledge of business or management, or do you need academics with real experience?
Julia.
I think you need both, actually, and that's certainly something we focus on, and I'm sure at Aston Business School, and I'm sure many other business schools would say the same. I am very keen that we recruit staff into the business school with strong business backgrounds, but actually I'm also very keen I recruit staff into my engineering school who've worked in engineering industry. And I think we actually in the UK, that's one of the innovations we need to get sorted quickly, is we need to find ways of moving people between our universities and industries and businesses much more than we do, because I think that would really, really help both parts of our economy, so to speak. It's a very important area.
I mean, Ruth, I remember doing my business studies degree over 24 years ago, and the lecturers that had that outward-facing experience within business definitely were the ones that you enjoyed their lectures much more, and it just felt more real to life outside. Just a quick comment on that.
Just to say, basically, that when I went to university, which is now a long time ago, the atmosphere then was so academic and so academically orientated, and when I asked was there any possibility of doing some work experience as part of my degree, I was told, my dear, we're not that kind of university. And I like to think we've made some progress in the intervening period.
Okay, quick comment from everybody else because we have to finish. One question we had in from a blog: what have the panel done to develop themselves this year? So one line on that, plus one line on the key messages you'd like to leave with the audience today. Julia, can I start with you?
I have an executive coach who we go through a range of exercises. In particular, I get him to work with me on how particularly difficult situations that I know are going to come up, what skills I have, and how I should approach those, and then we go back through what happened and did it work and what do I learn from it.
And final message?
It's a really useful thing to do, however senior you are.
Okay, thank you. Ruth?
I think my message is look around you, look at the talent in your organisation, and are you really developing them?
And Jonathan, anything you've done in the last year you'd like to share with the audience?
I know you're going to think this is absolutely pathetic, but I actually really did join the CMI in the last year. I'll tell you one thing I'm working hard on. I talk a lot about this business of risk-taking and imagination and empowering your staff. And what I've started to do is to test in my own company how much of that stuff that I talk about is really going on in our business and trying to close the gap a little bit.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Michael?
I changed jobs this year for the first time in 9 years, and I can tell you that was a shock. And so what did I do? I spend an awful lot more time now making contact with people who I really respect as good leaders and managers in their own right, and making sure I stay in touch with them. My message, it's the same one I had in my last organisation, same one I had now, is that I think the duty of every leader and manager is to make themselves redundant in their current role by thinking, right, what is it that I'm doing now that my team can do 12 months from now? And if you do that and they do that, then the whole organisation grows.
Richard, final word to you.
I guess for many years I've been operating in isolation, and this year for the first time I've taken it upon myself to find people who do the kind of job I do in the UK, and we've set up a kind of think tank together to try and improve ourselves. So it's a kind of community of practice idea which I was mentioning earlier. And in terms of messages, I think all organisations need to use this term match fit in terms of focusing on its customer activities and listening more to the customers. I don't think any of us, whether we're in industry or academia, listen so closely enough to our customers, and it's absolutely vital.
Well, thank you to our panellists. You've seen Julia, Ruth, Jonathan, Michael and Richard. Please show your appreciation for our panel. Thank you, guys.